Good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the Wisconsin Alumni Association and the International Division, we are so glad that you could join us for what we think will be a fascinating conversation about the 2020 U.S. elections' influence on foreign policy. Although, of course, we are unable to gather in person because of COVID-19, we are so glad that we could bring Badgers together for this virtual event. Today's program will begin with a presentation and it will be followed by an interactive Q&A session. That is your chance to ask all your great burning questions. So please make sure to submit them during the presentation in the YouTube chat function throughout the talk. Our speaker today is Professor Jon Pevehouse, a Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor in UW-Madison's Department of Political Science. He is a recipient of the Chancellor's Distinguished Teaching Award who specializes in American foreign policy, and I was even his student once upon a time. Professor Pevehouse is a rock star in the political science world, and it is my pleasure to welcome him to the program. It's so great to see you, Jon.
Great. Thanks so much, Jessica, for that very kind introduction. And yes, very sorry we can't be at our normal hangout spot talking about foreign policy, but in this age, it is what it is. So obviously, we have just come off a very momentous election in this country, and we have a change of leadership coming up, switch from the Trump administration to the incoming Biden administration. And so I wanted to give everyone some thoughts on sort of some overall issues, just sort of concerning polarization in the US and how I think that might play out in terms of foreign policy, but also talk about a few different issue areas, and I'm not going to be able to hit them all that are out there. So please ask questions. I'm going to try to leave plenty of time for some Q&A at the end. So some of the topics I want to talk about were especially places where I think we're going to see big differences, and a few places where I think we thought we might see differences, but I'm going to try to maybe throw some cold water on that. And so I want to talk about climate, relations with the EU, trade issues, China, obviously, along with those trade issues, the Middle East, and a handful of other topics. And we'll see how far we get. But again, I want to leave lots of time for Q&A and hear what you all have questions about. So let me offer a couple of just general overviews in terms of the election and the results. So obviously, it should be clear that we're a very divided America right now. Regardless of what way the Senate, who ends up with Senate control, we're divided. This was a huge turnout election. People were very motivated on both sides of the political spectrum. And so, that is something that the Biden administration has to think about going in. And that's going to be a theme of some of the things that I'm going to talk about. In particular, there were obviously a lot of very public breaks with the Republican Party by, for example, Republicans from the George W. Bush administration, from the McCain ticket and what would have been his staff when he ran for president. But yet I think when you go down issue by issue, you'll see that even though in general they were sort of an anti-Trump, the Lincoln Project, for example, it's not clear exactly what issues they're going to sort of rally behind Biden on, but we'll get to that. Another point to make, I think is kind of obvious, but it's worth remembering, foreign policy issues were not front and center in this election, right? Yes, there are troops in Afghanistan, there are troops in Iraq, and we've obviously seen the Trump administration on its way out trying to make some moves to further draw down those troops, but there's no significant U.S. deployments abroad. There have been no major terrorist attacks on American interests in the recent past. So there was some trade, obviously, and some discussion of immigration in the election. But foreign policy, the 800-pound gorilla in the room was the coronavirus. Another major issue were domestic issues with racial justice, right? There were just a lot of the top things people were talking about, and the exit polls coming out were not related to foreign policy. So I say that as sort of a way to say, like, what's, the Biden administration's, if you're looking for what their narrow incentives are to go run out and make policy changes, it's probably not exactly aligned with foreign policy change. That said, I think there's one issue, and it's the issue I will start with, where I think you will see immediate quick move foreign policy area, and that's climate policy, which again is sort of one of those domestic and international policies. Obviously, the Trump administration withdrew the United States from its presence in the Paris Agreement. That withdrawal took a year to take effect, and it took effect right before the election a few weeks ago. And so we are now officially not a party to the Paris Agreement. Biden has promised to re-sign that agreement, which can be done by executive order. Remember, Obama entered it vis-a-vis executive order. Trump got us out, and vis-a-vis executive order, Biden will get us back in the same way. The real question becomes, what does it mean to come back into the Paris Agreement? The U.S. has not come very close to meeting the purported goals of the actual goals of the Paris Agreement, and given Trump's position on climate-related regulation, et cetera, that probably should not be horribly surprising. Even, however, absent some of those changes, it wasn't clear exactly how close we were going to get to some of those goals. And the thing to remember is that unlike Kyoto, which the U.S. was also not a part of, Kyoto had binding commitments. It was what we would call hard law. The Paris Agreement is much more what we call soft law. These are sort of, they're not binding in the sense that there's punishments if you don't meet all the states have said, here's what we want to do, here's our goal, we want to publicly write this down, but no one's going to get punished if you don't meet those goals. I mean, you could be shamed, publicly by other states that do meet the goals, but that's kind of the extent of it. That said, it's really important symbolically. And this is the case that a lot of people were making in opposition to Trump pulling out, is that even if we're not going to meet the standards, even if he wants to do deregulation on climate issues, that it would still be helpful from a public relations standpoint to stay in. Trump disagreed, we got out. Biden's going to get us right back in. Domestic policy, domestic regulatory policy here is what's really important. Will Biden restore fuel standards for automobiles, those types of decisions? Like that's, it's going to be the policies that will help to implement what would agree to under Paris that's important. The other important thing I would say about the Paris Agreement and climate in general is that as Trump, announced that he didn't like the agreement, he's going to get us out, U.S. states and U.S. cities began to essentially pledge adherence to the agreement. So there are about 29 U.S. states who have essentially said they're going to comply with the Paris Agreement. There are over 300 U.S. cities who said they're going to adopt policies in line with how a city should comply with the Paris Agreement. So you've had almost this sort of federalization of climate policy, which is ironic given that, climate is a global problem. And the U.S. approach lately, at least, has been to kind of localize it, which advocates would say is better than nothing. Critics would say, the piecemeal approach just isn't going to work. It's not going to get us to that, 2 centigrade decrease in average temperatures that, we would want to see under the agreement. So climate is one of these foreign policy issues where I think you're going to see a lot of early movement by the Biden administration and some major changes and breaks. The balancing act I think Biden has to do here, this is, I will tell you firsthand perspective, the college students I'm teaching right now, this is their number one issue, almost across the board, without exception. Racial justice is obviously up there too as a domestic issue, but it is climate. And that's what they think about, and that is what they're really inspired to go out and do. Youth turned out at a higher rate for the Democrats this year. Do they feel beholden to them from an electoral standpoint? I think that's interesting to think through. The counter argument to that, right, is the easy talking point to people who oppose climate regulation policy is that it costs jobs. And in the middle of a recession, doing things to cause job loss is not going to be popular. So again, that's kind of going to be Biden's balancing act, I think, on the domestic side. Let's move to talk about another important topic, which is America's relations with some of our traditional allies. And in particular here, I want to focus on Europe. Biden is known, people in the foreign policy community call him an Atlanticist. Right, he is someone who has traditionally been a big fan of the European, of NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and he's also been a fan of the EU. He recognizes the EU represents economic competition, but his line since being a senator and in charge of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate has been that the world is better off with a strong EU. And this is going to be important later on that we'll talk about. I mean, the quick version is, Biden really believes that an EU-US axis is going to be the key to restraining China and Russia. And so I think if you're thinking like really big picture, grand foreign policy, Kissinger-esque, major balance of power, politics type things, I think that's Biden's worldview, is that we get along with Europe, we cooperate with Europe. He famously points out all the time, right? We're 25% of the global economy. EU's another 25%. If we band together, we're the majority of the global economy. We can tell China where to get off at that point. Again, we'll come back to this when I talk about China relations a bit. So I think you will see definite changes, especially in terms of the rhetoric, right? Trump from the beginning sort of was heavily critical of countries like Germany and what they paid for NATO, was critical of the EU as a major economic competitor. In particular, some of his close advisors like Jared Kushner really saw the EU as a major economic threat, almost as much as China. And so a lot of the policies then kind of pivoted around treating the EU as this sort of economic competitor. I think Biden will back off a lot of that rhetorically. I think Biden will continue on the NATO front to push NATO members to pay more. Remember, Obama had pushed NATO members to pay more. He did it kind of quietly. He didn't do it publicly like Trump did. And Obama got a little bit of movement. Trump got more movement, from especially like Germany and Italy. But he was obviously very loud and threatening about it, saying NATO had outlived its usefulness, et cetera, and that we should think about disbanding it, which of course made both Republicans and Democrats in the Senate mad. Biden's very pro-NATO, and my read here is that he really he's going to try to get them to pay even more using the quiet mode, right? Because he wants to kind of publicly demonstrate that Trump's plan really backfired, and that had Trump just been nicer, all these states would have paid more. Now, of course, his challenge is these European countries like the U.S. is dealing with coronavirus. They're dealing with deficits. They're dealing with publics who don't want to spend more on defense. So he's got a kind of an uphill battle facing him there. But I think in the big picture, NATO-wise, he kind of wants to prove that Trump's aggressive strategy was wrong, and that a nice strategy, the carrot strategy, is better than the stick strategy vis-a-vis NATO. So I think that's going to be important, and he's really going to disavow Trump's strategy there. The other point I want to bring up back to this sort of grand alliance idea between the U.S. and the EU. You remember sort of during the Obama administration, and even back to the Bush administration, there's this idea of TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Protocol. So people describe this as a trade agreement between the U.S. and the EU. It is a trade agreement, but it's mostly an investment and a regulatory agreement. Anyone that who does business and wants to export to Europe, that's always one of their first complaints, is that the regulatory standards in Europe are completely different than the regulatory standards in the U.S. So the TTIP agreement was an attempt to try to find some middle ground on some of this regulatory work. And what was interesting is that, it's kind of confusing. There's TTIP, TTIP, that's Europe, and then TPP, that's Asia. So if you remember, Trump gets us out of TPP immediately. He doesn't kill TTIP. And in fact, TTIP sort of behind the scenes went back and forth in fits and starts under Trump. He didn't kill TTIP. He didn't advance it too much, but it's still kind of on the table. I would not be shocked if in a year or two, a Biden administration puts a huge push on reemerging to TTIP. Again, it's kind of odd to say it will be described as a trade agreement. Trade agreements aren't about trade anymore. It's the first thing most macroeconomists would tell you. They're about regulatory policy. They're about investment disputes, those types of policies. And so, Europe, there's a lot of folks in Europe who are against TTIP. A lot of in America are against TTIP. So it'd be a big sell. But there are a lot of economic interests on both sides of the Atlantic who are interested in this. And if he wants an alliance and wants cooperation between U.S. and European firms, for example, that might be one route to go. Just sort of throwing an idea out there. That kind of segues into another kind of broader topic that's obviously relevant to American foreign policy, and that's trade policy. Now, we'll talk about China a bit separately, but in general, the Trump administration was much more on the kind of protectionist, pushed against trade agreements, as I just said, pulled the U.S. out of the TPP agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and put tariffs on Chinese goods. He put tariffs on European goods. He pledged no new trade agreements. He threw up a lot of walls to cooperation with the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And so in general, Trump had this very obviously America first, and that began with trade, right? You're going to protect American workers, put up these tariffs, et cetera. Needless to say, these tariffs were incredibly unpopular in trade circles, in what I would think of as sort of the Chamber of Commerce, somewhat, kind of the pro-business Republican circles. They were fairly unpopular, even among, for example, farming communities who saw this trade war as being very costly to them, and that sort of ended up putting them as the beneficiaries of U.S. tax dollars to sort of make up for those losses because of the tariffs. So what's Biden going to do on tariffs? Sort of generally speaking on trade policy. I think it would not be surprising to see Biden ease some of these tariff wars. Again, I think with Europe, I think maybe not with China. And I want to come back to this in a minute. I think the European trade wars, the trade tariffs that Trump had threatened to places like Canada, I think those are going to be off the table. I think Biden adopts a much more magnanimous approach on trade policy to our allies, right? Famously, Trump had threatened to essentially end the U.S. South Korean trade agreement at sort of one of the height of the Korean political North-South political crisis. You won't see Biden using trade as an instrument like that in sort of a very negative way. I think we'll keep the China tariffs, at least some of them, and I'll come back to that in a minute. As I say, the thing to remember here, two last points on trade. Domestic divisions matter. This kind of goes back to where I started, right? You had a very polarized election. You had, to be frank, you had the Democratic Party trying to get back sort of white working class voters who see trade very negatively right now, for the most part. And so, what is Biden's incentive to run out and champion free trade again if you want to get those back? Maybe you say, well, we're not getting those voters back and we want to do right and try to get sort of more the Lincoln Project Republicans back on board by doing trade. That could be a rational strategy domestically. But the thing to remember is that right now, both the Democrats and the Republicans are fairly divided on trade. Right? Remember, Democrats, you've got sort of the Biden pro-trade wing, relatively pro-trade wing, and you've got the Sanders wing, it's much more comfortable with protectionism. On the Republican side, you've got sort of what I would call kind of the Reagan Republicans on trade, right, which are very pro-free trade. Again, U.S. Chamber of Commerce type view on free trade versus, the old school, William Taft view, 2030s Republican view on trade, the Trump view, right, which is that trade is harmful, it causes these economic losses, and that therefore we need to be careful and put America first. And so given that both parties are divided on this trade question, you always think like what bill, what policy is going to get a majority through both houses of Congress, or does Biden just forge ahead with some of these new trade policies vis-a-vis executive order, which is also possible. The other quick thing to mention on trade that's been in the news in the last few days is there's a new sort of what we call a mega trade agreement that's been signed in Asia last week called ReCEP or RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. This is a trade agreement between China, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, 15 countries in the Asia Pacific region. Together, they represent about over 30% of global trade, global economic size, and entering up to 40 to 45% of global population is now covered by this trade agreement. Now, the trade agreement isn't particularly strong. Again, there's a lot of things that aren't in the trade agreement. There's nothing in there to restrain China from giving subsidies to its state-owned enterprises, which the Japanese were not happy with. Some of the media is painting this as a Chinese-led operation. It is not. It's actually a Japanese-led operation that essentially they saw the U.S. abandoning trade, right, in Asia. Right, we walked away from TPP, which then moved forward. We walked away from APEC, which was a previous U.S. Kind of originated agreement, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Agreement. That's technically still in existence, but the U.S. has just been inactive in it. So Japan, South Korea, these other countries see the U.S. kind of walking away, and all of a sudden, they kind of are looking for leadership, and so they provided it themselves. And I think this is one of the big takeaways of this new agreement. Not that it's necessarily going to do great damage to the U.S. economy, but just simply that Asian countries have just kind of left the U.S. behind diplomatically in the last 4 years. And, can the U.S. get in? Can they re-engage? Does the U.S. want to re-engage? Again, Biden has been saying no new trade agreements except under very particular circumstances. None of those circumstances exist right now in Asia with this agreement. So I think that's something new that's just going to be dropped in Biden's lap right as he comes to power. So I think trade is going to be one of these issues that's kind of lurking. But again, domestically, politically, I don't know exactly how you slice that cake. Of course, trade gets into China, the big foreign policy issue. And again, here, my take will be, and there's a lot of disagreement right now. If you were just reading sort of the pundits, the foreign policy pundits in the press, there's a lot of disagreement on what way Biden is going to go. Senator Biden, or Vice President Biden, was fairly positive towards China, or at least neutral towards China. He visited China many times when he was vice president. He tried hard to get Chinese cooperation on political military issues like North Korea. Even though as a senator, he very much championed, for example, he championed the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act, which kept the U.S. diplomatically sort of involved with Taiwan, even though we had just recognized China. But as vice president, he sort of pushed Taiwan to the side a little bit. So based on that, people are saying, well, he has a soft spot for China potentially. And this was the Trump administration. This was the Trump campaign line, right? Is that Biden's going to be soft on China. That said, Biden's rhetoric during the campaign, during the primary and the general campaign, was very anti-China, like incredibly anti-China. The Democratic political platform, the party platform, I believe, mentioned China over 20 times and needing to be tough on China. And that was kind of a significant departure from past Democratic Party ideas. And so I think this is one place where you might get some bipartisanship, right? And that neither Republicans or Democrats are particularly happy with China right now. What does Biden do about the trade deal that Trump signed in January of 2020 with China? I think he keeps it going. And let me explain why. I don't think he backs out of it. I think he keeps it and tries to actually promote it. And I'm going to tell you why. This deal that Trump made with the Chinese, right? So remember, Trump piled all these tariffs on Chinese goods. Chinese responded with more tariffs to the US. Trump makes this deal with them saying, we're going to cut back a lot of those tariffs. Not all, but a lot of those tariffs. And China, you've got to do two things. You've got to open your markets to more US goods and make it so US firms can compete more fairly, especially with all the businesses that are owned by the Chinese government, the Chinese military. And two, you got to buy a lot of American goods, especially agricultural products. China's done the first thing pretty well. You can find smart people differ on that, but they are at least in the ballpark in terms of opening markets. They've done horribly on number two. And again, depends who you ask. I teach political science, so it's political. If you're pro-Trump, you say, well, look, the coronavirus really crippled China's economy, and therefore they aren't going to be able to meet these quotas, right? Because that's what the agreement says, is that Chinese have to buy X amount of soybeans, X amount of wheat, right? There are all these products that the Chinese have to buy a certain amount of. The baseline for their purchases were set in 2017, right? So back, it actually was a fairly high point of Chinese imports of US goods. So China has to import a lot to meet their target. As of September, they were at about 40%, right? They weren't even halfway, 2/3 of the way through the year. China is not going to meet this target, even in another year and a half, most likely, unless some miracle happens. So Biden wants this, right? He could use this, and he can do two things with this. Number one, he can say, look, Trump made this great deal, right, air quotes, and it failed, right? And he'll try to use that politically within the country. But internationally, more importantly, what he'll say to China is, look, you made this deal, you couldn't keep it. Why should we make any more good deals with you? And he'll use that as evidence that China is doing these agreements in bad faith. And I think he'll use it as a hammer against China. And he'll use it as a way to reach out to the EU to say, see, you can't trust them. We made an agreement with them. They couldn't keep that agreement. And therefore, they can't be trusted. And we need to combine and join our forces to, in fact, go against them. So from that perspective, I think he tries to keep this deal together so he can kind of use it in that way. Maybe I'm being too negative about all this, but again, I study politics. So I do think that the trade agreement, there's going to be a lot more harsh rhetoric coming from Biden on China trade. What about other Chinese issues? Technology policy. I think you're going to see a continuation here of really pushing against 5G and Huawei type products. The whole TikTok thing, Biden has said several times, he doesn't exactly agree with Trump's position on TikTok, but that he understands the danger, right? As he put it, Chinese access to 100 million American, minds or whatever. So I think the rhetoric will be different. It won't be potentially quite as incendiary as it has been with Trump, but I think the policy is going to be there, on China. Things like human rights. And again, here's where the people who think Biden's going to be tougher on China point to. During both the primary and the general election. Multiple times, Biden described Xi Jinping as a thug, and sort of had some very harsh words for him, usually based around things like Hong Kong policy and policies about the Uyghurs and the concentration camps in Western China. And so from that perspective, I think Biden may continue to push. And again, this is an area of bipartisan agreement that you might see something on, right? But again, big picture, I think one of the main thing Biden really wants to do here is combine forces with the EU to take on China. We'll see if he can pull that off. Okay, Middle East, changing areas of the world completely. Lot to talk about in the Middle East. I'll try to keep it short so we've got some good time for Q&A and talk about a couple other things. Israel. So the Trump administration had obviously been very tight with the Netanyahu government. They pushed fairly hard early on to support Netanyahu. The Trump administration did. Israel had 3 elections to resolve their political uncertainty last winter and into the spring. Netanyahu finally is able to form a coalition and bring a government. Netanyahu used his ties to Trump to really elevate his political standing. How much it actually helped, we don't know. I have not seen any great studies of Israeli election returns on this, but I can tell you, good fortune immediately pre-COVID to spend some time in the region. Every billboard in Jerusalem that pictured Netanyahu either pictured Netanyahu and Trump or Netanyahu and Putin. This was his big electoral calling card, was I am a well-respected international leader. America loves me. By America, he meant Trump. Trump loves me. And we're getting what we want out of the U.S. because I have a great relationship with Trump. Well, Trump's not president anymore, right? And so you better believe Netanyahu's very nervous. A number of Israeli commentators have suggested this might undermine Netanyahu within Israel itself, and that we might see political changes there. I don't know that I would go quite that far for a variety of reasons that we could talk about, but I think that Netanyahu's nervous. Should he be nervous? I don't know. I kind of don't think so, and I'll tell you why. I do think Biden will be much more even-handed. I mean, by the end, Trump has not been seen as a neutral arbiter. If you care about the peace process, if you care about the Palestinian authorities' position in any of this, Trump was if that is your sort of side you're rooting for, if that's your position, Trump is a disaster in your mind, most likely. Biden will not be that. He will try to return the U.S. to being a little more of a neutral arbiter. Remember, Trump came up with a peace plan for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict without ever talking to Palestinians. That's not going to happen in the Biden administration. And so, that will change. That said, Biden promised during the election not to move the embassy. Remember, this was one of Trump's early controversial moves, was moving the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Jewish Israelis view Tel Aviv to view Jerusalem as their capital. Internationally, Tel Aviv is viewed as the capital. And every president ever has running for office in the U.S. has promised to move the embassy. None of them ever did. Trump did. Biden said he's not going to move it back. So that's sort of an early harbinger of maybe he's not going to change too much vis-a-vis Israeli policy, but he's going to be more neutral. This week Pompeo's in the region. Today I guess it would have been last night, he labeled the boycott movement of Israel as fundamentally anti-Semitic. He's saying a lot of very pro-Israel things. The Trump administration is trying to lay the groundwork. Pompeo is visiting settlements that under previous administrations were not recognized as legitimate under international law. Pompeo was just going there, places like the Golan Heights. So, sometimes you do these things diplomatically in hopes that you kind of create new norms, you create new practices. That's what Trump's trying to do. It's so late in the game, it's hard to know if it'll stick, but that's what Trump's trying to do. He's trying to create some he's trying to tie some diplomatic hands here with Biden to keep him sort of very pro-Israel. And again, I think Biden is pro-Israel. I don't think he's as pro-Israel as Trump. And I think he's going to try to be more even-handed. The big question with Biden has to do with Iran. And, remember the Obama administration and Biden as vice president were big fans of the JPCOA, right? This was the international agreement that essentially lifted sanctions on Iran in exchange for access to nuclear sites in Iran and a pledge by Iran not to build nuclear weapons. Trump, from the beginning, both as a candidate and as president, said, terrible deal, we're going to get out of this. Obama knew he could not get it through Congress, so it was just an executive order. So he undid that executive order eventually and gets the U.S. out of the Iran deal, much to the consternation of our European allies and other countries, much to the happiness of Israel and Saudi Arabia, because they felt like Iran was not going to comply with the deal. And let me just say from the beginning, there are good arguments for and against the JPCOA. Right. I'm not saying they're the ones that are always made by one side or the other, but smart people can disagree about the JPCOA. And I know people on both sides of this that I respect a lot. And I just think it's a lot about guessing what Iran's intentions are and guessing what Iran's compliance is going to look like with these agreements. So Biden has been very critical that Trump got out of this. Biden has said he wants to re-engage, right, with Iran and try to resuscitate this agreement. Now, the Europeans have moved ahead. Right after we left, here's my take on Iran and Biden. Biden wants to be tough on Iran. He's got every political incentive to do so. Biden liked the JPCOA, and he was convinced this was a good policy. What are his incentives to run out? And this is as I say, a very controversial policy. A lot of those Lincoln Project Republicans who were anti-Trump were anti-JPCOA. So what's the coalition the domestic coalition Biden can build to get an Iran deal back, right? Is he going to spend what clearly already very small political capital he has on Iran? I doubt it, right? That's just not going to happen. So again, you'll see a change in rhetoric. You may see back channel cooperation with Europe vis-a-vis Iran. You may see more talks, but is he going to fall on his sword to try to get Iran and the US back in some deal? I would be shocked. I just don't see that happening, because it just gives a lot of people who are seen as anti-Trump, moderate Republicans, a lot of talking points. And I don't think that's what he wants to start with. So even if he moves on Iran, it's going to take a while. Again, the rhetoric's going to change. You may see back channel stuff, but throwing it out there as my prediction. I don't think you see anything in the near term. You can't talk about Iran without talking about Saudi Arabia. And again, if Israel benefited from close ties to the Trump administration, the Saudis did doubly so. The Trump administration treated the Saudi regime very well on issues ranging from arms sales, on issues ranging from sort of turning a blind eye to Saudi actions in Yemen. We'll talk about Yemen in a second. To, frankly, Trump himself not condemning bin Salman from what the CIA says is clear evidence that he ordered the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, right, the Saudi dissident. Saudi Arabia has become very aggressive against states that push them on human rights and other issues. About a year and a half ago, Canada openly criticized the imprisonment of 2 Saudi dissidents. The Saudis responded by calling back, I think it was well over 1,000 Saudi students from Canadian universities. They stopped all flights from Riyadh to Toronto. They withdrew a lot of investment dollars from Canada. And Trump basically said, yeah, that's their right. That's fine. It was complete silence, and, the Saudis knew that Trump had their back. And remember, the first country that Trump went to after he was elected was Saudi Arabia. And part of that was an anti-Iran, right? And remember, that's the big rivalry in the region, sort of the Iran-Saudi rivalry there. And so this was a clear push to, we support Saudi Arabia, we support the Gulf monarchies versus against their fight with Iran. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia is deeply involved in the civil war in Yemen. On one side, Iran is involved on the other side. So Iran and other countries support, a couple other countries support the Houthis, which are the rebels against the sitting government of Yemen. And all of this happens kind of at the tail end of the Arab Spring. Yemen's been in a horrible civil war situation since then. What's bizarre is that you've just had everyone coming to Yemen to fight on one side or another. You've had the Houthis, who are a Shia sect, and so therefore sort of have natural alliances with Syria, with Hezbollah, with Iran, against some of the traditional governments, the more Sunni aligned government in Yemen, which is supported by Saudi Arabia and the UAE. It has been a bloody civil war, right? They have used food as a weapon. They have blocked ports for emergency aid. Both sides have behaved quite badly in this. The Trump administration wants to declare the Houthis a terrorist organization. There's been a lot of criticism of that, not because the Houthis have behaved well, but just that some of the government forces have behaved no better. And if you look at what the Houthi rebels have done and compare that to what 30 other rebel groups have done around the world, they should be declared terrorists too. So again, I'm not defending the Houthis. That's the argument against declaring them terrorists, right? And again, Trump's trying to tie Biden's hands, right? To try to say, look, any business that now does business with someone who's related to Houthis, like it's illegal, etc. So all comes back to the Saudi-Iran tensions, and how will Biden be more critical? So Biden was quite critical of the way Saudi was behaving and the Emirates were behaving in Yemen, and so you might see some change there. Again, the U.S. had blocked a lot of international condemnation of Saudi behavior in Yemen. Whether Biden will allow that condemnation, I don't know, but for sure he will not openly defend what the Saudis have done. Will he limit arms sales? Will he embargo? Will he support embargoes? Probably. I mean, I do think Biden will support an arms embargo into Yemen, which won't make the Saudis happy. So you've got, again, sort of, I think some kind of subtle changes that are really going to be happening in the Arabian Peninsula, in the Middle East. But again, the big picture of Iran, I just don't see it playing out. At least that would be my prediction. So again, just to reiterate a couple things, in terms of, I want to come back to and kind of close and take some questions in like 2 or 3 minutes here on bipartisanship. Again, you've had this large group of traditional Republicans supporting Biden on the foreign policy side. And because they've said Trump has been bad, and they've made all these arguments. And I think, if you're a Biden fan, this has been good. This was helpful for the election. But again, like, if you just go down the issues, right? JPCOA, would anyone who served in the Bush administration be a fan of JPCOA? Probably not. You may find one or two, but probably not. Are they going to be a fan of climate, of Paris? Well, Bush pulled us out of Kyoto. So odds are none of those folks are going to be very pro-Paris agreement, right? And so there are a number of issues. Just because someone's anti-Trump, right, doesn't mean they're going to be pro-Biden on some of these issues. And I think for me, that doesn't mean that Biden doesn't necessarily do things. It just means that he has to do them in kind of different ways. Whereas I think on issues of trade, he can pull some of these folks over. On some issues with China, he can pull some of these folks in. Even on some of these Middle East issues, I think even though people criticized the Bush administration for not being an even player in the peace process and sort of a two-state solution, there were a number of folks in the Bush administration who were important in peace talks and trying to push that forward. Maybe that is somewhere where he can get some bipartisanship and moving forward, given that, again, Biden has said, like, he wants to be bipartisan. He wants to try to find things that people agree on. But just remember, the parties, even themselves, are divided on some of these foreign policy issues. And I think that's going to make making policy and implementing policy a little bit challenging for Biden, even absent the potential of the Senate to block certain legislative activity. Lots of other things we could talk about, but I know we've got like 20 minutes or so left, so I want to maybe pause there and see what questions people have.
Well, that was fantastic. I'm wondering, like, the inside of your brain, does it go from like country to country like that, like the map behind you?
Exactly, that's right. There's pins on it normally.
Yeah, exactly, like different places. Yeah. Well, thank you for that presentation, and thank you everybody for your comments onto the side. This now is your chance, like I said, to ask some questions, and we do have some that have been coming in already. Of all of the things that you talk about, obviously, there is going to be President-elect Biden, but it's going to be the cast of characters that work along with him as well. Ron asks if you'd wish to speculate on who may be appointed to some of these important positions: Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and National Security Advisor.
Great, thanks, Ron. On one hand, no, because I think it's still a lot up in the air. the odds-on favorite, the easy one, I think the easy one, which means I'll be wrong. The easy one is Secretary of Defense. I think Michelle Flournoy is going to be the odds-on favorite there. She's fairly widely respected on both sides of the aisle. She's very much a kind of a technocrat in terms of she's well known within the Pentagon. She's respected by the military side, the civilian side, respected by both parties. Real kind of policy wonk. And in that way, not someone who's going to go out there and grab a lot of headlines, but someone who's going to get work done, try to maximize policy efficiency and policy effectiveness. So that's why a lot of people are talking Michelle Flournoy on the DoD side. Secretary of State, man, you hear a lot of names bandied about here. Susan Rice, obviously, would be up there. Former UN ambassador, and someone that, clearly got some serious consideration as a vice presidential possibility. And I think was largely pushed, I think Kamala Harris was chosen over Rice in part because domestically, Rice's bread and butter has always been State Department foreign policy. And so, she's considered to be very skilled at that. So put her where her comparative advantage is, and she's excellent. That might be she was not a huge fan of folks like McConnell. So again, what you have to think about with all of these folks is like, if Biden is facing a Republican controlled Senate, is it possible that, they could, really stop a lot of these appointments? Now, of course, he can do temporary appointments. Trump got into trouble for doing that in some instances. And so I think that's, up there. On NSA, someone like Jake Sullivan, could jump over. You could imagine worked for the campaign closely. I'm trying to think who else Secretary of State was, but if I were to bet, I would bet Rice, Flournoy, and maybe someone like Sullivan on the NSA side. Although Rice's NSA might make some sense too. So that would be if I had to bet, that would be who I'd put money on.
Well, then on the flip side, there are all the people that those people have to deal with. And I think we have some questions in the chat about how things might change under the Biden administration with sort of the traditional strongmen leaders, the Putins, the Kim Jong-uns of the world. How do you expect that may be different?
Yes, they will be much colder for sure. I think, and again, not that Biden's going to come in and be, I think, openly hostile. I mean, he is a consensus builder domestically. He tries to build consensus internationally. Again, I'm fascinated to see the China. Like, I do come down on he's going to be fairly aggressive on China, again, because I think he can get bipartisan support on that. I think he reads the public opinion tea leaves on that. And I think there's some issues where he can sort of make himself to be in the business what we would call a foreign policy hawk by keeping kind of the screws to China as much as possible. That said, is he going to threaten to, cut Chinese student visas to the United States, to universities? Probably not. He's going to be out there every day, saying terrible things about China? Probably not. But I think policy-wise, he will keep a lot of the screws to China. We didn't talk about Russia. I mean, we could spend the rest of the time talking about the Russia issue. I'll just say briefly, again, he's going to be fairly cold towards Putin. I think things will, it bears saying, and I had to remind a lot of my students of this semester, like, we have this image of Trump being very pro-Russia. And I would argue personally, he is, and he has tried to do things. He clearly, I think, admires Putin for some reason. He wants to be close to Putin. But if you look at actual policy, he wasn't able to get a lot of the pro-Russia stuff through the bureaucracy or even the Republican-controlled Senate. Like, they just wouldn't do it. Like, sanctions went up on Russia over time under the Trump administration. And so policy-wise, rhetoric, you saw one thing from Trump. Policy-wise, you saw another. He wasn't able to steer that policy ship very well on Russia. Now, I think Biden can steer that policy ship on Russia, and I think you will see increasing, again, softer rhetoric, like not out there, maybe in this case, slightly harder rhetoric vis-a-vis Putin, but on the policy side, you'll see different things. From Venezuela, I think that policy stays largely the same. Other strong Turkey. I saw someone, ask about the Middle East and Turkey. Erdogan is someone that, again, this is something where I think the Biden folks believe they can get together with the EU and put some pressure on not just China, but countries like Turkey, right? Erdogan claims he doesn't want in the EU anymore, after the first association agreement with Turkey and the EU was signed in 1964. So it's been since then that they've been knocking on the door. Europe said no. Erdogan has finally said, yeah, we don't care. So I do think you'll get the US and the EU trying to put some joint pressure on Turkey over some issues, especially vis-a-vis Syria. But there's this sort of Turkey-Russia frenemy situation going on that I think makes that very complicated. And then, you throw Russia into the equation when it comes to Iran and the Saudi situation, where, again, the Saudis and the Russians have every reason to hate one another, given that Russia seems to have Iran's back right now in these regional conflicts. Yet, was it 3 years ago, you had MBS and Putin giving each other a high five at the G20 meeting. So, I don't know how that all plays out. I mean, I think this is a very unsettling time in the Middle East. And I think Biden's going to have a challenge. I think anyone who's paying attention would have a challenge with kind of how you relate with Russia and Turkey in these regional conflicts in the Middle East.
Yeah, well, that was a good segue. We actually had someone, James had asked about how relations with Turkey would change, and I think you addressed some of that there. We have gotten a few questions here. You had talked about how Biden's likely to lean on his relationship with the EU quite heavily. Right. Can you explain where he currently stands on Brexit and how he's going to look to strike a balance there with trade and with some of the dynamics that are happening with that? Yes.
So I think he's going to be, my read on Biden and Brexit is I think he sort of sees Brexit as an unfortunate event. That said, I think he's not openly critical of it. As much as Trump was a champion of Brexit, I think Biden was an opponent of Brexit, but he just was not vocal and will not be vocal. You're not going to see Biden standing up saying, oh, this was a shame, you should really pull back on this. I think instead what you'll see is Biden sort of quietly, again, trying to work behind the scenes to try to make sure that the UK and the EU have some type of working relationship and agreement, because he wants both of them to gang up on China. That said, Trump was clear that he wanted a very good agreement with the UK. He wanted to reward the UK for leaving the EU. I don't think that's not going to be Biden's position. Will we have a bad agreement? Will we have a harsh agreement towards the UK? Probably not. But I don't think, my sense is Trump was willing to let a lot of things slide in a US-UK trade agreement that we would not otherwise see with Biden. Biden may not even make an agreement. He may just allow sort of smaller side agreements to take place. Biden has pledged that any trade agreement with any country is going to be negotiated with environmental interests and labor interests at the table. That makes reaching, the more people you put at the table, the harder it is to get an agreement. And so you may get no agreement. Whereas I think Trump would have pushed forward with something without those folks at the table and would have tried to, again, reward the UK. And I don't think Biden will do that.
Gotcha. Great. Thank you for that question, Mohammed. That was a great one. Wanted to ask you a question from Brandon, who asks what extent you expect the Biden administration to engage in the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict.
Right, over Nagorno-Karabakh. So again, this is one of these, I'm teaching an American foreign policy course this semester, and it's virtual, so it's harder to stand in front of students and say, hey, do you realize there's a war going on that none of us are paying attention to? Most of us aren't paying attention to, because this crazy election's going on. The U.S. has tried to do some, the Trump administration and the State Department in particular has tried to do some arbitration within that conflict. I think Biden will be the same. Again, remember, you've got sort of, Russia, Turkey heavily involved here. So in the geostrategic situation and idea, you've got, the U.S. kind of wants to be a player in that. Like, it's sort of good for us to be at the table somehow. We obviously have some interests there, diplomatic interests there. And in particular, sort of I think what's a re-emerging competition with Russia diplomatically in that region, Biden will want to be at the table. And again, Biden would want to be able to say, we played some role. Already the U.S. has tried to play some roles, been marginally successful at doing that. And my read on this, not to be critical of Trump or a future Biden administration, but this has been sort of insider policy folks really trying to get involved at the ground level to just stop the fighting and stop the shooting. There's not been a lot of top-down direction here, but it's been more sort of the local policy wonks that have been trying to work this out, and that will probably continue.
Gotcha. I have to ask, as you've talked about Iran and China and whatnot, at one point when you were talking about the Iran deal, you were saying this is probably not the sword that Biden really wants to fall on, something that his party would have supported, but it's just not going to be where he's gonna fall on the sword. Is there something that you see that is going to be the thing that he might be willing to do that for?
It's a great question. I think Paris, for sure. I think he tries to move heaven and earth. But again, I don't think he can get it through the Senate, especially as a treaty, because that's going to require 2/3, which he's nowhere near getting. The question is, could he get it somehow through an executive, what we would call an executive congressional agreement? NAFTA, for example, was a congressional executive agreement. Those only require 50%. So, if the Democrats are within 1 or 2 votes, can you get a moderate Republican to go along? Can you get a Susan Collins or someone else to come along with you on a Paris Agreement, and you actually get it made into legislative policy? Because at that point, if there's a Republican elected in 24, they can't just undo it, with the stroke of the pen. It becomes a much more sort of institutionalized agreement. And I think maybe he tries, whether he'll succeed or not. I don't know. But I think climate is an area where he could fall on his sword.
Yeah. Very interesting that you talk about doing something that a previous administration has done, because when President Trump came into office in January of 2017, that was some of the first thing he was doing, is just redlining things that the Obama administration had done over 8 years. You actually hear President Obama talking about that a lot now in his interviews he's doing about his book, about how difficult that was for them. But you're hearing from the president-elect that there are things he will undo that President Trump did right away too. Are there agreements that you think that he'll look to undo that Trump has done immediately? Do you think he'll face any criticism for that? And are there any past issues that you think Biden will undo that maybe even predate President Trump?
Right. Great question. So a couple low-hanging, again, Paris, he'll get back in. A couple low-hanging fruit that he will immediately work on is the WHO. He'll get us immediately right. The Trump administration took us out of the WHO and took us out of UNESCO. The Biden administration will certainly enter back in the WHO on day 1, probably enter UNESCO, maybe not day 1, but day 10 maybe. The global gag rule is always a big one. This is an executive order that prohibits U.S. aid from going to any UN or international agency that provides information about abortion. And this has gone back and forth literally since, I think, the Reagan administration implements the Mexico City policy. It then Clinton comes in and does it, and it goes back and forth each time. It'll go back and forth this time again. There are any other agreement-oriented things. In general, the WTO I mentioned, the World Trade Organization, the Trump administration has blocked the appointment of some judges at that. The World Trade Organization has a dispute settlement body. There's like a court that kind of hears disputes between countries on trade. And he's blocked judges such that the WTO is having trouble hearing cases right now, not just U.S. cases, but all cases. And I think Biden will come in and immediately change that. Although, again, Obama threatened that. Obama actually did hold up some of that. Trump just kind of doubled or tripled down on that. So Biden will ease up. I don't know that he'll go back to, say, the Bush or Clinton years where sort of anything went. So he'll certainly undo that. Any other executive agreements? The funny thing about all this, I will just say, for those of you who are political science majors back in the day, or in this day, there's this theory we often talk about as the democratic peace. It's like democracies don't fight, democracies are better governments. And one of the main arguments is, well, democracies are better governments than non-democracies because policies don't change so quickly in democracies. It's like, oops, well, okay, there goes that theory. So it's time to go. We need to get back to work on that as a discipline. So, there have been entire books written on, democracies, once they set a course, they just keep going. It's like, well, and 30 years ago, that was true. But not anymore. So I think that's something that we need to revisit as sort of a thing that we think about democracies, for sure.
Stroke of a pen. Stroke of a pen could make a difference. Jim asks an interesting question, especially in light of the fact that President-elect Biden would be the first Catholic in office since John F. Kennedy. Can you talk about the relationship that he may have with the Vatican?
Interesting. That's not something that I've read or thought a lot about, but it's an interesting idea. You know, it could be something that, you know, and again, the important thing to think about Vatican policy is really, it's obviously not materially powerful. It's about the ideas and sort of the symbolism of that. And, you know, given that from everything we read, the current Pope tends to have somewhat more progressive ideas about the way the church should go, and that Biden himself sees himself as sort of a progressive Catholic in that sense. You know, that you might see some traction there, and you might see some action there. You know, historically, it's fascinating to think about, right? That less than 100 years ago, one of the main criticisms, or even 50 years ago, one of the main criticisms of a presidential candidate would be like, oh, they'll be too close to the Vatican, and that'll be a problem for America. And like, it was just, you know, that's the norms change, right? And standards of these things change. So it's just kind of interesting, but great question.
Yeah. Marcia asks, do you think the new administration will pay up the UN and peacekeeping dues?
Right. Oh, yes. Great questions on UN stuff there. Will we pay up? If the Democrats get the Senate, yes. If McConnell retains speakership, no. That said, we probably will try to pay up more. We'll do better. Again, I don't think we'll necessarily use the checkbook as a tool of foreign policy as much under Biden as we did under Trump. Again, UN policy will change pretty significantly under Biden. You know, it's not beyond like global gag rule. The Trump administration was very aggressive, for example, within the UN, for example, is defining all human rights as religious rights only, right? And that's what the US really should care about. It's only religious rights. Forget freedom of speech, forget economic freedoms for sure. And it was about religious rights. And that was a huge break from Obama. That was even a bit of a break from the W administration, who championed religious rights, but also kept other things on the table. So those types of inner negotiations with like the Human Rights Council, et cetera, will change under Biden. Someone asked, I noticed about CEDAW. Like, no, you know, that's because that's up to the Senate. You know, you're not going to get 2/3 of the Senate, I think, agreeing on CEDAW or the rights of the child. And I would just point out, as I do to my class every year, you know, I think we're the last country left in the world not to ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And that's all the Senate, right? The U.S. has signed all of these things. It's off the president's desk. In most cases, it's just sitting on the Senate calendar. So I don't see any movement there because that's really a Senate issue.
Gotcha. We have another question from Ron about Germany and the role in Europe and the EU, especially with Angela Merkel's position.
Yeah, great question. You know, Germans are nervous, I think, needless to say. You know, she has been the focal point of German domestic and international policy now for a long time, widely respected. And even when people disagree, you know, look, she caught a lot of heat over refugee resettlement and immigration issues, the rise of the AfD, you know, and the right-leaning parties in Germany were clearly, you know, kind of increased a lot of the unhappiness with her in Germany. That said, she brought a lot of respect and pride to Germany, and I think things will be different under a new leader there. And, you know, this is where I think the Biden administration I think Trump would have treated a new German leader as someone who's sort of inherently inferior and someone that could potentially be taken advantage of. I mean, you know, kind of learning on the job, et cetera. I think Biden will be much more cordial towards a new German leader. You know, the question is, does Germany maintain its sort of leadership in the EU, in Europe, common foreign security policy in general? I see no reason to expect that to change under a new chancellor, but there will be questions about it, right? Because there's a new chancellor. It's just like electoral turnover here. What's going to change? You know, what's going to be new? Will there be a new vision? And I personally don't see that, although Germany is not my particular area of expertise, but it's just hard to imagine, you know, any other country filling that vacuum really aggressively. Maybe Macron comes in there, but Macron's got some of his own domestic difficulties right now. And obviously the Brits are gone. So like, who's left?
Right. Well, and all of that, the backdrop of all of that, and I think you call it the 800-pound gorilla in the room, is how all of these countries are dealing with coronavirus and how COVID-19 is just really reshaping how all of these leaders have to deal with their countries. How do you see, we talked about so many other issues here, but as our sort of final ending question, given that's the main thing that most people are focused on right now, how do you see coronavirus and a potential vaccine, of course, playing out as a foreign policy element over the coming months?
It's going to be huge. And, I think there's a lot of uncertainty, and I think a lot of people are speculating on this. I'll be blunt. I don't know. I don't think people can see. We've not lived through something like this before. Wars, terrorist attacks, all these crises, recessions. It's like, okay, there's a template. The flu, the 1919 flu, SARS, all these things, were in a different context, different sets of globalization policy, standards, et cetera. So I think, in my opinion, the U.S. is leading the global vaccine race. What happens if we win this, we're able to roll this out. Russia has their vaccine. Who knows what that's going on there? I don't believe anything they say about this. China, is quickly, once they claimed they had a decent vaccine, began exporting it. They sent it to Brazil. They sent it to other countries. Brazil immediately last week stopped because they said they were having difficulties with it. So, who does the U.S. give it to? How do we roll it out? Obviously, it's going to be U.S. first. But then it's like, how does that change? That could be a huge feather in the U.S. cap diplomatically. That could be a huge economic boon to the United States to get it going first, right? And we're the first ones to climb out of the economic hole, right? Like, there, you hate to say it, but there's like some, if you're kind of the realist, cold-hearted, like there's some major benefits that could come out of winning this vaccine race. Everyone knows that, and no one's talking about it, and no one is really talking through kind of what the implications of that are internationally. But they're potentially massive. Does this mean the world is going to change and globalization is going to change? No, but we're going to, over the next year, have a real test case about what it means for the U.S. all of a sudden to be back in a leadership role, especially on global health and potentially economically. And I think that's something, we, for our own sakes, we should hope for getting a vaccine, but I just think it's going to be interesting to look at diplomatically.
Right. It's just such an element that those of us who are working from our basements aren't necessarily thinking about it.
Exactly. Day. Right. Of course.
So very important to think about. Thank you so much, Professor, for all of your insights. All of the folks in the chat are so appreciative of being able to hear from you in this format. And we are very, very happy to bring it to them. So thanks again for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, on behalf of the Wisconsin Alumni Association and the International Division, which is also celebrating International Education Week this week, I want to thank you all for attending. A special thank you, of course, to Jon Pevehouse for his time and expertise. And before we go, I would also like to remind our viewers that we have a couple more events coming up that would be great for you to attend as well. On December 3rd, we have Better Sleep, Better Health, featuring Dr. Steve Barcy. And on December 17th, we have Poetry of the Moment, featuring UW professors Ahmad Jamal Johnson and Shireen Sherrard, which were both featured in On Wisconsin Magazine this month. You'd find them on the cover. You can register for those events and more at uwalumni.com. Again, we so appreciate you taking the time to join us today. Thank you so much, and On Wisconsin.